Mr. Speaker, like many before me today, we've acknowledged that our parliament is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and established people. And I know, like many Canadians, are thankful for the freedom that we have to speak and for the opportunity to speak to what has been a sad legacy and a dark chapter of residential schools in Canada. Today, Mr. Speaker, I will be sharing my time with my colleague and the member for Winnipeg North. The residential school system is a national tragedy. It was born of colonialism and it was propelled by systemic racism. That we can all agree on. And I think all of us are still very shocked and very profoundly upset with the news that we heard coming out of Kamloops First Nations in the last week. And unfortunately, they are not alone. And once again, this is the evidence of the pain that has been experienced by generations from the legacy of residential schools and the system they were entrapped in. And many continue to experience that pain today. I know this very well because I know my riding and I know the people that I serve. Many of them are victims of residential schools. The pain and hurt of that experience follows them to this day and unfortunately will follow them and their families for generations to come. You know, our government is the first in history to actually step up and talk openly about reconciliation with Indigenous people as a Canadian government. We are the first government to establish that reconciliation with Indigenous people is a priority for us and for Canada. And Canadians supported this and they embraced it. I also want to outline that as a government, we are deeply committed to advancing reconciliation and to the healing of Indian residential school survivors and their families, and to providing supports depending on the wishes of those communities. And more specifically, we are deeply committed to supporting survivors, to supporting families and communities, and to help locate and memorialize through ceremony the children who died and went missing. You know, the first residential schools were opened towards the end of the 19th century, and they never ceased operation till nearly the close of the 20th century in 1996. That's only about 25 years ago. So it's not ancient history, and it's not without its impacts being felt as deeply as they are today. The darkness and the pain that came with learning the news is not going to cease today or tomorrow or in the days and years ahead. But I hope that someday in this country, we will have achieved reconciliation and healing for all of those who were deeply harmed and hurt. The legacy of residential schools continues to this day with Indigenous people, as I've said. And it's felt in many ways through poverty, food insecurity, through mental illness, physical health, and more commonly and most known through death by suicide. This is the sad outcomes and legacy that follows residential schools. For First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, while they live with this legacy, they also live with the post-traumatic stress and the intergenerational trauma that accompanies it. And what I do know is this: In the riding that I represent in Labrador, despite consistent lobbying and advocating, despite good investments that we have made and continue to make, there still needs to be more focus on mental health and on healing. There are still far too many people that are asking for help that they're not getting. There are still far too many people that are reaching out in words and actions to a dead end. That is something we need to focus on. If we are really to help in this healing process, it has to also start with mental health services. It has to start with providing the supports that people need to function in everyday life. It has to start with ending poverty and closing the gap that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. It has to ensure there is food security, there is heat security, and that opportunities are equal to all kids. As we talk about the dark chapters and the sad legacy of residential schools, I also fear for the future yet of many Indigenous kids in this country, only because I see what transpires before our eyes each and every day in this country still, where far too many kids are still being removed from their communities, from their cultures, from their language, and from the people who love them. And while they may be removed to be safe, we need to find ways to keep Indigenous kids safe without having them lose everything else that provides value in their lives. I deal with issues almost on a daily basis in my riding of children that are being sent hundreds of kilometers away, thousands of kilometers away in some cases, to be fostered into families and homes that I'm sure in many cases are loving and supportive. But I also know that these children are losing things that are very valuable to them. They're losing the opportunity to grow up in their own culture, to learn their own language. They're losing the opportunity to visit with those that they've learned to love and know. And we need to find a better way. And we can only do that when we work with leadership within First Nations, Inuit, and Métis governments. This has to be a priority for everyone. Children, Indigenous children, has to be a priority for everyone. And while it's a priority in terms of when we speak, when we give that commitment, we need to ensure that it translates into real, substantial change on the ground that is going to ensure the safety of these children, but the health, the mental health, physical health, and the overall well-being of these children as well. When we talk about the legacy of residential schools, and we feel each and every day as we walk with those we know and love, we feel each and every day the serious consequences that it has left behind. And I know that many people have asked that history be erased in some ways. But you know, we should never erase history. And when it is so bad, so sad, so horrifying, we should never repeat it. And in order for that to happen, we need to fully understand it. So if we're to move towards meaningful reconciliation for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, together, moving forward, then we need to have that level of respect. We need to have transparency. We need to have accountability, but we also need to have understanding